So a few years ago, I found myself in one of those situations that are really uncomfortable as a researcher and that really kind of test the limits of your ethical commitments in research. I was asked to serve as an expert witness on a copyright case between two musicians I got to know through the course of my research regarding Tuareg music in Niger. In the course of my own fieldwork, as part of my work to identify and understand the breadth of Tuareg guitar repertoire, I recorded an artist who I will call Ibrahim, who performed a song, translated it with me, and explained a bit about how he had written it. I hadn't heard anyone else performing it during or prior to my longest fieldwork stint in 2016. So I was surprised when I heard it prominently featured on an album released a few years later by a different artist who had more traction among global audiences. I'll call them Suleiman. I was less surprised, however, when Ibrahim contacted me to solicit help in his pursuit of a copyright infringement case in the United States. He connected me with an American lawyer he had met who asked me to write an expert witness report and share copies of the recordings, transcriptions, and translations I made as supporting evidence. Providing the requested materials felt like an ethical obligation, even as I feared providing it would damage my relationship with Suleiman, not to mention complicate other relationships in the artist community. As much as I agonized over the potential personal costs of my decision, I was not comfortable with refusing to share what I did know, knowledge that I could have only developed through the generous participation of people like Ibrahim and Suleiman. So I won't identify the individuals involved or go into details about the case for reasons I hope that are obvious. Beyond any legal risks to myself or others for sharing such information, I'm not really aiming to be like an arbiter of the reputations of two artists that I really respect and admire. Furthermore, by the terms of the fallout from the case, it's actually in both artists' material interest to sell as many of those albums as possible. So go buy Tuareg albums, just buy them all. They're all great. What I want to think about instead is the cultural conditions that entangled me, Ibrahim, and Suleiman, and the American justice system in this moment. I use the word moment here deliberately. For one Tuareg artist, bringing a compatriot to task in the apparatus of international law is a different matter than, say, any of the many examples of global North musicians implicated in intellectual property abuses of artists in the so-called global South. Example that jumps to mind immediately is Solomon Linda, the composer of Mbube, which became The Lion Sleeps Tonight. It's a case that is really important in South African copyright. And there's a great book about that I can talk about later. I will talk about later. There are interwoven layers in the development of popular music and intellectual property law in Niger that enabled this episode. Attending to the specificity of these threads is crucial for making sense of how, when, and why a Tuareg artist in 21st century Niger would opt into a legal battle over a song, a choice that might seem obvious to musicians in the litigious United States, but which has not always appeared as an appealing option to Nigerian artists. In other words, I'm introducing Ibrahim's case only to illustrate the broader stakes of the music economy in Niger that I've been exploring in my work. And as I'll discuss today, I argue that claims about authorship are themselves claims about citizenship. So to make sense of the complicated relationship of Tuareg musicians to intellectual property in Niger, it helps to understand the conditions that engendered Tuareg guitar music in the first place. In the 1960s and 1970s, a combination of political marginalization and a series of major droughts, compelled many Tuareg youth from northern Mali and Niger to migrate to urban centers across Northwest Africa. By doing so, they abandoned the rural nomadic economy that had long been the foundation of Tuareg lifeways in the Sahel and Sahara in order to pursue wage labor. These young exiles thus became known as Ishumar, a Tamashek or Tuareg language adaptation of the French word chômeur, meaning an unemployed person. Ishumar adapted Tuareg oral poetry and Tende drumming to sing of their experiences abroad and their nostalgia for home, soon incorporating their newfound exposure to other musics like Maghrebi Rai and Euro-American rock music to develop a distinctively Tuareg style of guitar. One of the most important sites for this development was the southern Algerian town of Tamanrasset, circled here. But many Ishumar were also invited to Libya in the mid-1980s to receive military training at a camp funded by Muammar Gaddafi, who sought to leverage Tuareg disaffection in his machinations for greater regional influence in the region. While this affiliation was short-lived, it did supply Ishumar with some of their first electric musical gear, amplifiers, electric guitars, microphones. It also provided space in which to develop a more militant political vision for the Tuareg nation that took charge over the course of the 1980s. two key groups emerged from the Libyan camp called the Champ de Mars. The first was Tenariwan, who was comprised principally of Tuaregs from northern Mali, and who many of you may know as sort of they're marketed as the founders and innovators of the style of music. They often tour and come through here in Boston and then across the United States, really worldwide. And the second group was Takras Nakal, which means rebuilding the country, which was founded by Nigerian Tuaregs and led by Abdallah Oumbedougu, who is credited as the so-called father of Tuareg guitar in Niger. Now, there seemed to be some initial efforts to engage artists amidst the rumblings about rebellion that were circulating in the 1980s. In 1990, for example, Takras Nakal was specially invited by the Ministry of Youth, Sport, and Culture in Niger to participate in the fourth edition of Niger's national music competition, the Prix d'Angournou. But they never participated again. Just a few months after the competition, Tuareg groups took up arms against the Malian and Nigerian states in a protracted uprising that lasted until the mid-90s. This Tuareg rebellion, as it became known, coincided not only with Niger's first transition from military rule to multi-party democracy, but also with the drafting of the state's first copyright legislation. I'll come back to this point in a few minutes. But what is immediately relevant is that the rebellion intensified state suspicion and repression of Tuaregs, encouraging the Ishimar to keep their playing and the cassettes they circulated underground. As the guitarist Umar Amathar Bambino recalled to me, for example, before the peace accords, I don't think you could play guitar, because if you played guitar, the government would search for you. They're looking for information, they're looking for rebels. So as soon as they hear guitar, surely it's some Tuaregs who are there. So you have to go where the guitar is playing to find these Tuaregs. It was always a risk for artists to play in this period. Whether in shanty towns in Algeria, Libyan military camps, or in the scrutinized Tuareg quarters of Nigerian towns, Ishimar guitar emerged and remains rooted in what political scientist Obika Gray calls exilic social space. Writing on the social history of ghettos in Jamaica, Gray outlines how Black working-class Jamaicans in the 1960s developed a cultural world relatively autonomous from official Jamaican life. In this exilic space, Black Jamaicans engaged in a distinctive form of cultural labor for self-making, engendering a moral and political refuge from post-independence coloniality through music, dance, sport, and one's everyday comportment. Although Kingston's crowded slums differ from the living conditions of Ishimar in many important ways, Gray's analysis is helpful for attending to how Tuareg guitar develops in an alternate system that is separate but not wholly divorced from the broader Nigerian national culture. Tuaregs have often lived on the margins of Nigerian society in the last century, both during the French colonial regime and since independence. Between a predominantly nomadic lifestyle and the extended anti-colonial resistance of several Tuareg communities in the early 20th century, Tuaregs have generally not been as deeply integrated in the colonial and post-colonial economies, education systems, and states as other communities. This exclusion was a precondition for the Ishimar generation's migrations to Libya and Algeria, and it's also apparent in the muted references to Tuareg music in the archive of the Institut National des Arts et de la Culture, INAC, which is a state institution. But as Bambino's comments attest, state suspicion during the rebellion intensified artists' movement into this exilic space. Indeed, participants in the rebellion, many of whom were artists, routinely camped in the remote Ayer mountains of northern Niger, pictured here, where state forces had limited capacity to monitor them. So what does this have to do with authorship and ownership? In the Libyan camps, as well as in the mountain hideouts, the nascent guitar culture was conditioned by the peripatetic lives of the Ishimar youth. Groups like Tenariwan and Takras Nakal were collectives of fellow artists who came and went more than they were the stable ensembles that characterize many professional Tuareg guitar bands today, when this music has become a global force. Members learned from each other, sharing their songs in jam sessions and through dusty cassettes traded across the Sahara. And while individual artists gained reputations for the beauty of their poetry in this new rebellion repertoire, their songs developed into what the guitarist Arudeni Ismail calls a common heritage, played and playable by anyone committed to the Tuareg cause. As one example, here's an old cassette recording attributed to the year 1990 of a song composed by Abdallah Oumbedougu, as I mentioned, the founder of Takras Nakal. Entitled Arhat Tumast, it was composed in 1989, and it's a call for Tuaregs to unify in their struggle for justice. As you'll hear, cassette recordings in this generation were typically made with cheap portable stereo systems without professional microphones, making it difficult to always discern the song texts. So singers would occasionally recite poetry or offer verbal explanations of the songs before they begin playing. Musicians would actually before performing it. Also mentioned that Abdallah Umudigu is in the center there with the tan turban and the guitar. So Arhat Tumas is one of many rebellion-era songs that remain a popular part of the repertoire to this day. And indeed, in 2016, when I was in Niger, another member of Takras Nakal named Risa Wanagli performed it during a celebration of the anniversary of the 1995 peace accords that had ended the first rebellion in Niger. Unfortunately, I didn't film this particular performance, but I did have the audio recording, so I'm showing you film from a different song, so don't get wigged out when you don't see him singing along, but you're hearing him singing along. That's intentional. So the signing of the peace accords launched a new era for Tuareg guitar. Many young artists found that they could freely perform for the broader Nigerian public for the first time through performances at weddings, baptisms, or naming ceremonies, political rallies, or celebrations like the one I just shared. In time, many artists also found global audiences through recordings and tours. One could even register with the Nigerian Copyright Office, the Bureau Nigérien des droits d'auteur, or BNDA, and ostensibly receive royalties. For some artists, the opportunities were enough to make something of a living as a professional musician. And while the rebellion songs continue to this day to be the foundation of our guitar repertoire, the professionalization has engendered divergent views on how authorship may or may not govern an artist's right to record or perform a song. Ibrahim and Suleiman's case that I opened with is just one of many potential illustrations. Another is that many of the songs of the first generation Ishimar have been recorded by other artists, sometimes without attribution or permission. For example, the song Hey Tenere has been recorded on multiple albums by younger artists like Bombino, and some albums identify this as a traditional song. Classic move to not have to pay any royalties to someone, right? But in other cases, it is attributed to its known composer, Abdallah Umbudugu. I think there's more to this story. I don't think it's just one artist trying to rip someone off. I think there's maybe some miscommunication happening there. My point is not really to weigh in on the particular grievances between the musicians, but to kind of look at this as a broader phenomenon. So let me play you a little clip of this recording by Bombino from 2004 on this album. Might recognize this actually from the very opening of the documentary about his life called Agadez, produced by a filmmaker based in the Boston area, Ron Wyman. So many more examples abound across the Tuareg guitar scene today. On one hand, this represents the common heritage mentioned by Rodney. On the other, there is the emergent perspective reflected in the remarks of another Nigerian artist when they observed to me that Tuareg musicians all steal each other's songs. This person, by the way, was not Tuareg, but I heard this from many Tuaregs as well. The rebellion legacy of mobilizing for collective justice thus lingers in growing tension with artists who today regard authorship and ownership as matters of moral and economic rights. As many scholars have shown, ownership is an increasingly significant force shaping cultural production in late modernity. For example, in his recent work on copyright in South Africa, I mentioned this earlier, the anthropologist By Erelman argues that making sense of post-apartheid society is better served through attention to property and ownership than to identity per se. He claims that ownership has turned from a marker of racial privilege into a pivot around which virtually every aspect of South Africans' public and private lives is centered. Erelman shows how copyright policies have a pervasive impact on multiple layers of life and have become a focal point in South African social justice organizing, like the case of Solomon Linda that I mentioned and the Lion Sleeps Tonight for Mbube. South Africa is not a unique case in this regard. Drawing on examples from across low and high income countries, scholars of law and of culture widely emphasize the coloniality of global intellectual property regimes. Because knowledge production, including songwriting, can serve as one of many forms of capitalist production, it relates to broader legal systems around property ownership. As the communications scholar Boatema Boateng argues, by invoking both ownership and property, intellectual property is premised on alienability. In this way, then, it is fundamentally entangled with the commodification of culture. The roots of today's global intellectual property regime are in the various copyright and patent laws established during the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe and North America, which sought to protect the economic interests of creators and encourage further intellectual production. While each empire and its corresponding colonies were characterized by their own legal particularities, the mass expansion of European imperialism in Africa generally advanced intellectual property protections for metropolitan rights holders, but not African creators. In an essay on the colonial legacy of the world copyright regime, the legal scholar Alexander Peukert notes that he found no documentation of a successful copyright infringement case by a non-European resident of a European colony. But whether in the empires of Britain and France or in the United States, the discriminatory nature of intellectual property has often been obfuscated by race-neutral rhetoric. For example, Peukert finds that British and French laws did not explicitly discriminate based on the nationality of an author, but rather by establishing additional requirements that effectively limited access to copyright protection to Europeans and potentially certain local elites. French law initially would only protect works that had been deposited at institutions in France or that were first published there until the mid-19th century. And this precluded the protection of the vast majority of colonized people. Furthermore, the French Empire set up separate judicial systems for French citizens and for colonized peoples. Meanwhile, in her work, The Color of Creatorship, Anjali Vats reveals the rhetorical work that since independence and through the so-called post-racial turn has linked racial capitalism in the United States with creatorship and citizenship. She identifies the formation of an intellectual property citizen as an idealized good citizen, one who is creative, entrepreneurial, imaginative. This framing is implicitly based in whiteness, maleness, straightness, and serve to discredit people of color by treating their creative labor as derivative imitations, rather than meeting the conditions of the US legal doctrine of true imagination. Thus, this notion of intellectual property citizenship categorized most of the creativity of people of color as a form of theft, thereby denying their work legal protection while extending the capacity for white people to own not only the physical labor of people of color, but also their intellectual labor and their likenesses. And Vats goes through a number of different historic cases in copyright and patents and trademarks in the United States. It's very interesting history. A further consequence of the coloniality in the intellectual property regime is its insistence on an identifiable author. This might be an individual person, although businesses also might be treated as legal persons. Regardless, however, this framing assumes a liberal subject floating independently from any sort of web of social relations. Yet this is rarely the reality. In traditional Akan music in Ghana, for example, dual ownership links individuals and their communities. The ethnomusicologist Eric Biko argues that this is not a form of capitulation to the people, but rather reflects the principle that an individual always finds their rights, freedom, and humanity in relation to the community. Rights ownership, he writes, then becomes an entitlement that everyone in the community has. First, by the fact that he or she is a human being, and second, by virtue of being a member in a lineage. It becomes a shared property that places the individual's rights in a joint relationship with their community's rights. Boateng explores a similar dynamic in her work, The Copyright Thing Doesn't Work Here, where weavers of Ghanaian Adinkra and Kente cloth recognize the creative contributions of individual artists who create innovative designs while remaining within the broader lineage that Ghanaian intellectual property law frames as folklore. It's helpful to return to Jamaica to begin tying these notions of authorship, ownership, and citizenship back to Tuareg music. Building on Gray's formulation of exilic social space, media scholar Larissa Mann explores how Black working class Jamaicans in Kingston's impoverished zones of official neglect create social lives and popular music in relative independence from the state's social order. Thinking through the racial exclusions embedded in Jamaican copyright law, she characterizes this art world as one driven by a sort of rude citizenship, invoking the image of rude boys, fans of Jamaican ska music who rejected the mores of Jamaican elites. Rude citizenship, she writes, makes claims on Jamaica rooted in community-based cultural norms of social engagement, centering Blackness and practices associated with Blackness that directs authority and resources to those most exploited by colonial power. In other words, rude citizenship rejects the official intellectual property regime to invest in one that is meaningful in Kingston's exilic space. So this is illustrated in a particularly compelling example that highlights the disconnected meaning of the term original in music. So where original in a legal framing suggests a degree of uniqueness that is a prerequisite for claims of intellectual property ownership, in Black Jamaican music, original refers to the communal value of recycling the same rhythms or instrumental tracks that have undergirded generations of hits. An artist creating a new rhythm or new instrumental track for their music might claim originality in the court of law, but as Mann shows in a really memorable anecdote during a music competition, someone might be chastised by their peers for not meeting this sort of social value of recycling those originals. So let me play you a little audio just to demonstrate this distinction. So what I'll play first is what's called the Diwali rhythm. This is one of the classic rhythms in a lot of Jamaican music. Whole instrumental track. It's not just the beat that you're hearing, but all the instruments involved are often recycled in a lot of different songs. So here's the that same original. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of the the concept that that man is exploring in Black Jamaican music. And you might have seen on my screen when I pulled it up on Spotify there, but there's whole compilation albums where there's dozens of tracks all using that same rhythm, all kind of compiled together. Very important for dancehall and other Jamaican music. So for Black musicians in the exilic space of urban Jamaica, to be a good citizen is clearly not the same thing as being the idealized American intellectual property citizen critiqued by Vaz. Returning to Niger, then, this raises the question, what makes good intellectual property citizenship in Tuareg guitar? While I argue that exilic space is a useful framework for interpreting the social condition of Ishimar musicking, it would be going too far to also characterize this context in terms of rude citizenship in the Tuareg context. As Erelman cautions, one must beware making the assumption that breakdowns between law and society, like those of Jamaica or South Africa, are general conditions of the global South. Doing so not only flattens the particularities of individual countries, but also risks ignoring the importance of social relations in intellectual property regimes of the global North. His warning echoes the sentiments of anthropologists Roshenthaler and Mamadou Diawara, who in their book on copyright in Africa argue that it is an oversimplification to assume that African states import intellectual property regulations from the global North. Rather, one must attend to how actors in each of these contexts appropriate and transform these systems in relationship to existing practice and technology in their respective contexts. So intellectual property citizenship for Tuareg guitarists is complicated by two converging threads in the 1990s. The first is the historic transformation of Ishimar guitar into a public popular music, not only in the Sahel, but worldwide, following the peace accords in Mali and Niger. While rooted in exilic space among the Ishimar and during rebellion, the commodification of guitar music changed the stakes of authorship and ownership. The second thread is the development of Niger's popular music industry and copyright infrastructure, which achieved major milestones at this same moment of transition in Tuareg guitar music. Like many countries in the global South, Niger overhauled its copyright legislation in the early 1990s in response to intense pressure to sign the Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, or TRIPS agreement. At the time of its formal independence in 1960, Niger inherited from the French colonial regime the legal commitments of the Berne Convention, the first major international copyright treaty, which had been signed in 1886. While Niger signed later key conventions like the 1977 Bangui Agreement, which established the African Intellectual Property Organization, it was among the many lower-income countries worried about economic sanctions if they refused to sign TRIPS as a condition for membership in the nascent World Trade Organization. Critics have characterized this as a new form of imperialism, its coloniality clear in its Eurocentric definitions of authorship that have effectively privileged corporate extractivism. While legislation governing the management of folklore and traditional knowledge are some mechanisms that have sought to soften this blow, the net effects continue to engender ambivalent responses across much of the global South. Nonetheless, in March 1993, Prime Minister Amadou Cheikhou signed a decree defining Niger's first autonomous laws governing copyright, performance, and broadcast rights and expressions of folklore. Furthermore, it established Niger's Copyright Office, the BNDA, or Bureau Nigérien du droit d'auteur, charged with collective management of royalty payments, among other duties. This came at a crucial time in Nigerian politics, as the state was implementing democratic reforms after nearly two decades of military governance. But it also emerged at a consequential time in Nigerian popular music, not only because of the emergent Ishimar guitar style, but also because of increasingly focused efforts to cultivate a popular music infrastructure. In reviewing materials archived at the Institut National des Arts et de la Culture, INAC, the National Institute of Art and Culture in Niamey, one's really struck by the monumental efforts of artists and bureaucrats in the 1980s and 1990s to create a vibrant homegrown music industry. These largely, a center-known one is widely called Musique Moderne Nigérienne, it's written at the very top there, or modern Nigerian music, an ambiguous appellation connoting music that integrates imported instruments like guitars, pianos, and horns. Critical efforts included organizing a national music competition, first held in 1981 and later known as the Prix d'Angoulême, establishing a musicians organization, the National Association of Authors, Composers, and Performers of Modern Music, or ANASIM, which brought focus to shared concerns and had legal standing with the government, And finally, by appealing to the state to integrate music in the national education curriculum and to establish a network of regional and national orchestras. Nationalist sentiments often emerge in the discussion about modern Nigerian music. Many advocates saw a need to promote what they refer to as Niger's cultural development by encouraging artistic creativity, especially among youth. The speeches, meeting notes, and newspaper articles in the Enoch archive reveal that many of these advocates had a chip on their shoulder about the state of Niger's popular music, particularly in comparison to other Sahelian countries. For example, in a handwritten draft of remarks advocating the establishment of a national orchestra, the unidentified author argues that modern Nigerian music emerged only as recently as 1974, the year when Sani Kunche came to power in a coup d'etat, subsequently leading the country until his death in 1987. The author not only claims that the idea of a national orchestra emerged as early as independence, but also cites Mali and Guinea as role models, two countries whose national orchestras continue to serve as major touchstones in post-colonial Sahelian music. Meanwhile, in his written report on the first national music competition in 1981, Keletigi Mariko, the president of the jury and a celebrated homme de couture, lamented that in all of the Republic of Niger, there are not 10 orchestras or other modern music ensembles deserving of the name. In this domain, our country comes well behind countries like Guinea, Mali, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and Haute-Volta or Burkina Faso. From the perspective of many artists involved in these advocacy efforts, a more toothsome copyright infrastructure promised by the 1993 law and the establishment of the BNDA seemed a welcome development. While not catalyzed by their petitions so much as by the pressures of neoliberal capitalism executed through the WTO, the World Trade Organization, it legitimized some of the demands that popular music industry actors had been making for years. To advance its implementation, in 1994, the World Intellectual Property Organization organized a national seminar on copyright and related laws, together with the governments of Niger and neighboring Burkina Faso. There, the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization officials and Nigerian officials met to present and discuss perspectives on the Berne Convention, copyright law in Niger, African folklore, musical life in Niger, cultural industries, and piracy. At the seminar, Jibo Munkaila, the director of the BNDA, introduced the goals for this institution: to contribute to national creativity, echoing the goals of earlier European copyright policy, to promote creative production, to oversee the collective management of rights and royalties related to musical and literary works, and to manage rights related to Nigerian folklore. This mission is intended to represent and defend the interests of Nigerian authors and artists, both in Niger and abroad. Authors and editors of musical, literary, graphic, and plastic works of art could sign up with the BNDA, as could producers and performing artists. Through their affiliations, members can register their works with the BNDA and collect royalties twice a year, which derive from payments by radio and television stations, foreign institutions, and other organizations or individuals to obtain authorization from the BNDA to reproduce or publicly circulate registered works, places like hotels, bars, and so on. As one might anticipate, given the vibrant scholarship on pirate modernity and on copyright claims in the world music industry, the accomplishments of this new legal apparatus have not always satisfied the expectations among Nigerian cultural actors. Yakuba Adamu, a reggae artist known as Blackmailer, who has led a musician syndicate and has worked with royalties in the BNDA, explained in an interview how challenging it was to cultivate a culture of copyright where none existed before. He told me, you know, the BNDA is like the AIDS question in medicine. When AIDS began, I worked in the health of it, and not all the doctors knew about AIDS. We had to teach about it. The BNDA has thus organized communications and outreach campaigns to educate the public, as well as institutions regularly using musical works, such as hotels, bars, transportation companies, radio and TV stations, and telecommunications companies like Airtel or Orange. This past January, thanks to Wallace, and Jenny, if you're out there, thank you. This past January, I had the luck of showing up at the BNDA office on what just happened to be one of the 2 days per year when musicians' royalties are dispersed. The building was abuzz with staff busily working in scattered offices, while a growing crowd of men and women chatted jovially in a narrow hallway on the second floor, waiting to be summoned into an office to receive their payments. At the entrance on the lower level, a 13-page spreadsheet had been printed and taped to the wall, displaying the names of the 622 musicians and musical groups slated to receive some kind of payment. I had arrived to interview the BNDA director, who at the last minute canceled and asked her deputy, Amadou Batoure, to meet with me instead. Beforehand, however, I stood in line with my friend Mamansani Mati, a professional musician whom I've hired on occasion for occasional research aid, as he waited to collect his own royalties. After his name was called and he disappeared behind the closed doors of one of the air-conditioned offices, he returned and expressed surprise that for this round he had received only 12,500 sefa, a little over $20. This is much less than usual for him. While he's not a major celebrity, Mamansani is fairly well known in Niger, as I immediately saw whenever I walked around town with him, and people, complete strangers, would greet him from across the street and things like that. When we later chatted with Amadou Batoure, the assistant director at the BNDA, about royalty distributions, he lamented that for this 6-month period, the BNDA had only received 22 million sefa, or about $35,000 for the entire country. Of 36 radio stations registered in Niger, he lamented that only 6 had paid the fees that they owed the BNDA. So after years of witnessing musicians' critiques of the BNDA, this moment really drove home for me the stark contrast between the office's means and artists' expectations. Nonetheless, cultural actors in Niger, whether artists and composers or bureaucrats in the Ministry of Culture, continue to seek ways to bolster the BNDA's collecting capacity so that greater royalties might be paid out. While these discussions once lingered on preventing piracy of physical media like CDs, in 2025, that conversation has largely been replaced by advocacy for charging new fees for telecom companies and import taxes on various audio equipment. People sort of accepted that it's not worth the effort to try to stop piracy of physical media because no one's really using it anymore. The effects of these various licensing and royalty challenges is to discourage musicians from associating with the BNDA. Tuareg guitarist Kiljat Musa Albade, pictured here for example, once told me that I don't have confidence with the BNDA. Recalling his band that he had formed as a teenager called En-Noor, he elaborated on the relationship to the organization. We recorded our music, we made CDs, we brought about 4 CDs to the BNDA. We heard our music on the radio and everything, but from 2002, 2003, 2004 until today, there's not been a cent from that. Nobody's ever called us to explain. For example, sometimes the BNDA invites all the musicians to discuss everything that's going on with them and all that, but we've never seen anything like that. This was in 2016. By contrast, Musa, like many other Tuareg artists I've spoken with, expressed more confidence in the Society of Authors, Composers, and Publishers of Music, or SACEM, the French copyright and collecting organization. This is not unusual among former French colonies, given not only the continuing influence of French law in these ostensibly post-colonial settings, but also the ways in which broadcast fees in Niger were handled through French institutions like SACEM for several decades after independence. Thus, while moving into the public sphere in the late 1990s allowed Tuareg guitar to ride the wave of new copyright legislation and the institutionalization of Nigerian popular music, many artists lost faith in the BNDA as their expectations for royalty payments went largely unmet. Criticizing the office has become a recurring theme in media and musicians' discourse, revealing, as Ryan Skinner argues in his analysis of copyright in Mali, a sort of crisis of political subjectivity. That is to say, the perceived shortcomings of institutions like the BNDA are understood as symptoms of a deeper disregard for popular artists. This is true of all Nigerian musicians, yet the legacy of Exilic space and rebellion in Ishimar guitar amplifies the sense among Tuareg artists that while they may wish for these conditions to change, their needs are best met outside the official structures of the state. In other words, then, even as the development of Tuareg guitar into a popular music in Niger contributes to its commodification and to greater concern with intellectual property, it remains rooted in Exilic space, where, like for Black Jamaican musicians, an alternative intellectual property citizenship takes shape. Rather than channel disagreements through the apparatus of the BNDA, the rights and privileges of authorship are governed through the relationship of Tuareg artists to one another by virtue of their citizenship in the Tumast or Tuareg nation, rather than legal citizenship as Nigerians or Malians or Algerians or so on. In other words, there's a matter of confiance or trust among one another. Many of these issues coalesce in attitudes regarding the performances of covers, the performance of a song by someone other than its original author. Tuareg musicians refer to this practice as interpretation, reproducing the vocabulary of Francophone copyright laws that identify performing artists as artiste interprète ou exécutant. A critical distinction is whether a song is covered in a live performance or recorded in a studio. There's a practical benefit to performing covers. As in many musical traditions, a common repertoire allows musicians to play together who might have never met before. In many West African musics, including to our guitar, musicians might cycle in and out playing lead or accompanying parts in a performance, either a formal performance or something more informal as well. For paid performances, like weddings or naming ceremonies, the common repertoire enables artists to be flexible and available for more gigs on short notice, including when they or their preferred accompanists might be traveling and therefore unavailable. This happens all the time. You'll see the same featured solo musician with totally different groups on Saturday, and then on Sunday a totally different group, right? They don't always have a consistent band the way that you might expect if you're going to see Tenari on tour in the United States. But making a studio recording is a different matter. Unlike many live performances, recordings typically involve artists with extensive experience rehearsing together in preparation for the studio session. As the guitarist Mdu Mokhtar explained to me, for us Tuaregs, there's no problem with performing covers live. But recording at a studio, that's like a phone number. You see, recording at a studio is a sign that says that song is yours. Normally, someone should only record their own works, not what he doesn't have. The distinction between the acceptability of performing covers and the inappropriateness of recording them readily maps with the globalized copyright model, in which the materiality of recordings serves to fix songs as copyrightable works and also facilitates disputing unauthorized use. A telling example for the situational evaluations of appropriate and inappropriate performances and recordings is the song Chet Bogassa. Written and composed by Abdallah al-Husseini of Tenariwan, it recalls an important battle from the 1990 rebellion in Mali and became a well-known song of the Ishimar, later appearing on one of Tenariwan's earliest international studio albums, Amasako. I'm going to play a clip for you, so let me switch back over to here. So here is so I'll stop that version there. But in 2010, we're good. Okay. In 2010, Bombino performed a blazing fast version of the Chet Bogassa outside the Grand Mosque in Agadez, Niger, as part of a public concert that served as his homecoming celebration following several years of exile in Burkina Faso. This was actually following what became known as the Second Tuareg Rebellion in Niger between 2006 and 2009. And this was captured in a really memorable documentary. I mentioned Agadez, the film filmed by Ron Wyman here, based in the Boston area. So this documentary, this clip I'm about to show you is from this documentary, and it became a bit of a sensation, circulated all over YouTube and other social media. And Bombino's version became one of the most popular pieces in Agadez for many years. When I was there in 2016, young guitarists would often try to show off their guitar chops by playing basically as fast as they possibly could to see who could do it better, right? So to give you a taste of that, here's Bombino playing. That's great. As I just said, it's on YouTube. You can find that full thing if you want. It's a great clip. I've been watching it for 15 years now, and I still go back to it all the time. You've seen me present before. You've probably seen it as well. I love that clip. It's no surprise, though, that because of the popularity of Chet Bogassa in Agadez, that other versions emerged, right? Chet Bogassa appears, for example, on an album by the American record label Sahel Sounds. Here I'm repping them with their little stickers. They released a compilation of field recordings of live performances in Niger by Mdou Mokhtar, another artist. And so I'll play a clip of this as well, just to saturate you with as much music as possible. Out there, but you can get a sense from how closely that follows the how close. Sorry, the muting situation is throwing me off on my computer. Gives you a sense of how closely that follows the Bombino version. Even the solo part is almost identical, right? And this, Mdou Mokhtar is not alone in this. Everyone is trying to copy that same preferred version that they really like. And as I said, trying to play it as quickly as humanly possible. What's important in this case, though, for Mdou is that it is not a studio recording. From his perspective, there's no implied claim of authorship. In the studio, he says, it's you yourself who decides what to record. At weddings, many people can come record with their devices. It's not the same thing. And I'm guilty as charged, right? I've recorded many things with my phones. Including of songs that artists would never record in the studio. They would not record themselves. But furthermore, in live performances, musicians are often expected to play requests, which often include popular songs not composed by the performer. And this opens up a whole other can of worms that we talk about afterwards if you're interested about some really interesting cases of people refusing to play songs that are requested and handing the guitar to someone else to meet their request, but they won't bring themselves to this base level to play a song that they really hate. While litigation over copyright disputes might be a familiar and accepted avenue for redress among American musicians, for Tuareg artists in Niger, the matter of confronting those who make improper use of compositions remains complicated. Asked to compare his experience of how copyright in Europe and the US works with how it works in Niger, Bombino was matter of fact. Here in Niger, he says, if you want to make a new album tomorrow and you copy me, who's going to take you to the judge? Nobody, because everybody's copying. This is not only because of the general lack of faith in the Beyandeya, however. Another crucial dimension is the role of Ashak, an important social value in Tuareg communities. Often glossed in English as honor or dignity, Ashak is a multidimensional concept. Of particular relevance for the present discussion, it governs a reserved mode of carrying oneself, showing restraint by not complaining of hardship or showing disrespect to elder family members. It thus plays a quiet but important role in disputes about using another person's songs. For example, in a conversation about his relationship to a younger artist named Chingu, Mdou told me, we have our copyright among us. As Tuaregs, we consider ourselves like we're all family. I can't take Chingu to copyright because he played my song. That's impossible. I can't even talk to Chingu because he played my song. To say, why do you play my songs? Why do you take my songs? Why do you do such and such? That's shameful for us. We don't say it. We only leave the person. You see, we don't talk about copyright. We don't talk about Bruno. Sorry, that just sprang to my mind. Meanwhile, when I would discuss authorship and copyright with another artist, Mohamed Karzo, he expressed strong opinions about the importance of composing one's own songs, but never offered names of specific artists as examples of those who tend to perform covers. Hoping to sort of coax him out and talk a little bit more openly and identify some concrete examples in order to gain clarity on the politics of covers, I brought up occasional observations I've heard about Bombino being an artist who has often recorded songs that he did not himself compose. I anticipated a spirited response. Perhaps I cracked open the door and he was going to say, yes, there we go. That's it. But his response instead was rather muted. He said, yeah, that happens. He didn't really comment on it. He didn't elaborate on it, anything like this, right? This is a kind of a classic sort of example of Ashak, something that a lot of Tuareg artists kind of preserve, like you might have strong opinions about something, but you're not going to just, certainly not on record. You're not going to say it, right? You just sort of say, well, that's not how I like to do things. And you leave it at that, right? Very indirect in many respects. But the ability to address ownership claims is not only dependent on evidence that a theft occurred, but also on the particular relationship of the individuals involved. Gerontocracy, class, and other dimensions of relationality play a crucial role in many of these interactions. For example, Mtu and Chingu are of different age cohorts, and at the time of the comments that I've cited here, it would have been unusual for them to socialize together in the informal settings where a lot of music making happens, like social groups called badas. It's not simply a matter of belonging to a different age cohort, though. There's also a perceived generational shift away from what many Tuaregs call the time of Ashak. Musa Alwade recalls, for example, that during the heyday of the first Ishumar musicians like Abdallah Umbadugu, nobody spoke of jealousy. Nobody spoke about he stole the other's music and so on. No. But if you were to talk about Namju and of this jealousy, I'm in agreement. It's the new generation. It's normal. It's what they do. So this brings us back to the moment where we began, to the story of Ibrahim and Suleiman. If social relations shape the channels of redress available for any individual artist, but the globalized commodification of Tuareg popular music and the development of intellectual property infrastructure in Niger seems to afford is a new pathway, as revealed in Ibrahim's legal case. Drawing on Erelman's critique of legal scholarship, which he claims is overly focused on law's instrumentality or its ability to achieve an end, I want to table the temptation to focus on the breakdown of copyright enforcement at this juncture. Bringing a case through the American legal system in which Tuareg artists have more faith than the BNDA is a straightforward enough strategy from this perspective. But the more significant story here, I would argue, is that it hints at a shift in Tuareg social relations. Ibrahim's copyright case is made possible not so much because of changes in law per se, but because those changes in law transformed how artists might relate to one another. Put another way, I suggest that the bolstering of copyright infrastructure in Niger not only provided an instrument for claiming ownership, but also modeled a socially acceptable way to make this claim where other pathways might have been closed off by their social relationships. In this way, then, it seems that through claims of song ownership, Tuareg artists today are defining a new sense of Tuareg citizenship. Thank you.